Imagine just completely starving yourself, like
Hmm.
enduring brutal physical combat, giving up all human comforts for 10 straight months. You put your body through the absolute most agonizing, relentless conditioning you can think of.
Yeah, just total deprivation.
Right. And you do all of this, you sacrifice almost a year of your life to win a grand prize that is, well, made out of dried celery, like a literal weed that is going to rot in the sun by Tuesday.
I mean, it sounds completely absurd to us today, but in the first century, people actually did that. That was the absolute peak of human achievement in their culture. They gave up everything for soup ingredients.
A celery crown. It is just wild to think about. Well, what does a withering piece of vegetation have to do with the total collapse of modern leadership? Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm your host, and today we are doing a deep dive into the severe spiritual realities behind leading others.
Yeah, we are taking an intensive look into the soul of spiritual leadership.
Spot on. We are analyzing the Apostle Paul's regent warnings in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and tying that in with the sharp insights of J. Oswald Sanders. Our mission today is to uncover the internal perils that threaten to disqualify even the most gifted individuals.
And, we are looking at this through the lens of our provided sources, which are rooted in a very specific, uncompromising view of human nature and grace.
Right. And I want to say this straight to you, the listener. Whether you guide a massive congregation or you're raising children in your living room or, maybe you just counsel a friend over coffee, you have influence. You are leading someone. And this conversation is going to challenge how you view the safety and the success of that influence.
Absolutely. The stakes are much higher than we usually admit.
So let us talk about the celery crown, because to grasp why the Apostle Paul issues such a severe warning about leadership, we have to understand the hyper-competitive world his original audience lived in. So what was happening in Corinth?
Well, first century Corinth was not some quiet, contemplative village filled with monks. You have to think of it as a cross between Wall Street, Las Vegas, and like a massive international shipping port.
Okay, so incredibly busy, very wealthy.
Very. It was a booming Roman colony, refounded by Julius Caesar. And because it sat directly on this narrow isthmus connecting mainland Greece with the Peloponnese, it controlled the major trade routes. I mean, if goods were moving east to west in the ancient world, they went through Corinth.
So it's a city defined by intense commercial competition, staggering wealth, and a lot of intellectual pluralism. Everybody is trying to get ahead, right? Everybody's trying to make a name for themselves.
Spot on. And with that massive influx of wealth and all these transient populations, you get an incredible level of moral degradation. I mean, looming right over the city was the Acrocorinth, which was this massive rock outcropping.
Oh, right, the one that had the temple.
Yeah, it hosted the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The local culture was just so saturated with pagan worship and ritual prostitution that the ancient Mediterranean world actually coined a slang term for it.
I remember reading this. It's crazy.
Right. To Corinthianize literally meant to engage in extreme sexual licentiousness and drunken debauchery.
That is wild. I mean, when your city becomes a verb for losing your mind in debauchery, you know you have a cultural problem. It was basically a byword for living entirely for the flesh.
Yeah, it really was. The population was this volatile, explosive mixture. You had Roman freedmen trying to establish their newly acquired status. You had Greek natives clinging to their ancient heritage. And then wealthy Jewish merchants, transient sailors, philosophers, grifters. It created a society that prized individual liberty, self-assertion, and material success above all else.
And central to this cultural obsession with status were the Isthmian Games, right? These were athletic contests held right there in Corinth, and they were second in prestige only to the Olympics.
Oh, absolutely. The citizens of Corinth were totally fluent in the language of the racecourse and the boxing ring. That was their dominant vocabulary for excellence.
The athletes competing in these contests were subjected to immense public adulation. I mean, the crowds treated them like literal demigods.
They did.
Yeah.
But to get to that stadium floor, they had to undergo a brutal, strict 10-month training regimen. We are talking about severe dietary restrictions, absolute sexual abstinence, and intense physical conditioning under strict supervision.
Just grueling.
Yeah, they even had to swear a solemn oath to the gods that they had fulfilled all these regulations without cheating.
And again, all of this for a corruptible crown. The sources point out that initially the prize was made of pine branches and later, literally just a wreath of dried wild celery.
Just a weed.
Right. They sacrificed 10 months of their lives denying every natural human appetite, all to win a piece of vegetation. I mean, they did it for the earthly fame, the tax exemptions, and the civic honors, sure. But the physical prize itself was garbage.
And the tragic reality is that the Corinthian church imported this exact cultural lust for status right through the doors of the congregation.
They didn't check it at the door.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They did not leave their pagan worldview outside when they converted. They brought the competitive, status-seeking energy of the stadium right into the church.
And you see this when they started forming personality factions. You read 1 Corinthians, and they are saying things like, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos. They essentially turned the apostles into celebrity athletes.
Yeah, they treated them like the philosophers down in the marketplace.
And at the same time, they boasted about their absolute liberties while completely disregarding the weaker believers among them.
Right. The church failed to recognize that they were evaluating their ministers by the standards of Greco-Roman rhetorical sophistry and charisma, rather than by theological faithfulness.
Wanted a good show.
Exactly. Spot on. They were judging the heralds of the gospel by the metrics of a pagan entertainment culture. They wanted their preachers to sound like the celebrity philosophers.
The irony here is just so thick. The Corinthians felt entirely spiritually secure because they possessed remarkable spiritual gifts and high theological knowledge. The sources show they prided themselves on how much they knew, yet in their daily conduct, they were acting entirely fleshly.
It's a massive disconnect.
It makes me think about evaluating the skill of a highly trained heart surgeon based entirely on their Instagram follower count. Like looking at the ring lighting in their social media videos rather than looking at their medical precision in the operating room.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. You are using a completely irrelevant, superficial metric to judge a matter of life and death. They were looking at the outward show, the eloquence, the confident assertion of individual rights.
Right. They were mesmerized by the surgeon's TikTok dance while ignoring the fact that the patient on the table is bleeding out.
That's a very vivid picture, but it's totally accurate.
But let me push back on this, or at least ask for some clarification. If the culture was so visibly corrupt, if they literally have a temple to Aphrodite towering over their daily commute, why did the believers feel so safe in their behavior? Did they not look around and realize they were blending right in with the pagans they were supposed to be distinct from?
Well, this gets into the psychology of privilege and immunity. Visible privilege often creates a false sense of security. When people acquire correct theological knowledge, or when they experience the visible blessings of a thriving community, the brain often does this strange trick.
What kind of trick?
It assumes that the knowledge itself acts as a magical shield against moral failure.
So because they knew the right answers on a theological test, they thought their actual behavior did not matter.
In a sense, yeah. The Corinthians knew that idols were mathematically nothing. They understood the monotheistic reality. They had the right theology in their heads. But they wrongly assumed that possessing accurate doctrine gave them a free pass to engage the culture without any personal restriction. They divorced what they knew in their heads from what they did with their bodies.
And because the Corinthians presumed their theological knowledge gave them a free pass, Paul had to deliberately dismantle their understanding of what rights actually mean for a Christian. This brings us to the literary flow of chapters 8 through 10 in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, he takes their whole argument apart.
Our sources show that Paul is not just jumping around randomly. He is building a very specific, logical argument. Let us connect these chapters.
We have to look at the conflict happening in chapter 8. Paul directly addresses these strong believers. These were the individuals who possessed the correct theological knowledge that idols were non-entities.
Right.
Because of this knowledge, they felt entirely free to eat meat that had been sacrificed to those idols in pagan temples.
Let us unpack the mechanics of that for the listener, because we do not really have a modern equivalent to meat sacrificed to idols. Pagan temples in the ancient world function a lot like local steakhouses or butcher shops, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
After an animal was sacrificed to a god, the priests would sell the leftover high-quality meat in the marketplace, or they would host banquets in the temple dining rooms.
Precisely. So the strong Corinthian Christians are thinking, Apollo does not exist. Zeus is fake. It is just a piece of beef. I am going to buy it, eat it, and maybe even attend a civic dinner at the temple because I know the god is fake.
The problem was that their public exercise of this freedom was ruining the conscience of the weak believers. These weaker Christians had just been pulled out of that pagan lifestyle. To them, eating that meat felt like active demon worship.
It was a huge stumbling block.
And seeing their church leaders chowing down on temple steaks was incredibly confusing and destructive to their faith.
This sets up chapter 9. Paul shifts the focus to himself. He uses his own life as the ultimate illustration of self-limitation. He lists out his apostolic rights. The Greek word here is exousia, which means authority or a legally permissible right.
He had a lot of them.
He did. He outlines that he has the absolute right to demand financial support from the church. He has the right to take along a believing wife on his travels. He has the right to all these apostolic privileges.
Yet he voluntarily abandons every single one of them. He works as a tent maker to support himself so that he can offer the gospel without charge. He refuses to use his exousia.
And that leads directly into chapter 10, which provides the terrifying historical warning of the wilderness generation of Israel. Paul points out that the ancient Israelites possessed immense covenantal privileges.
They saw miracles.
Right, they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food. They had the sacraments, so to speak. Yet despite those extraordinary privileges, they were overthrown and destroyed in the desert due to their idolatry and their complete lack of self-control.
So, Chapter 9 acts as the crucial bridge between the intellectual arrogance we see in Chapter 8 and the physical devastation we see in Chapter 10. The sources show that Paul is proving, through his own physical example, that true Christian maturity is not demanding your rights to the absolute limit.
No, it's the opposite.
True maturity is willingly surrendering those rights for the spiritual good of others.
The Corinthians viewed their liberty as the supreme measure of their spiritual status. They thought freedom meant the ability to do whatever was technically permissible, regardless of the collateral damage to the community.
Think about a person driving a high-performance sports car at top speed through a crowded school zone. If a police officer pulls them over, imagine their defense being, well, the car has the mechanical capability to go this fast, and I have a valid driver's license. It is my car. It is my gas.
It's totally missing the point.
They are entirely focused on their mechanical capability and their legal right to drive, while completely disregarding the vulnerability of the children walking on the sidewalk. They possess the right, but they lack the love to restrain it.
That is the exact Corinthian mindset. They had the theological license, but they were causing spiritual casualties everywhere they went. They were running over the weak believers with their theological sports cars.
But let me ask the question that I think a lot of listeners might be thinking right now. Why does Paul not just tell the weak believers to toughen up?
That's a fair question.
Like, why not just sit them down, run a quick seminar on the correct theology about idols, explain that the meat is fine, and tell them to stop being so sensitive? Why force the strong believers to limit their perfectly legal freedoms?
Because the mechanism of knowledge, isolated from love, always inflates the ego. Paul explicitly says in the text that knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies.
Right.
The kingdom of God, according to these sources, prioritizes the spiritual survival of the brother over the intellectual vindication of the individual.
So having the right answer does not justify crushing someone else with it.
Right. Let us look at the psychology of being right. When you possess superior knowledge, your brain rewards you with a dopamine hit of superiority. You feel vindicated.
We all love that feeling.
We do. But if asserting your correct theological knowledge causes a brother for whom Christ died to stumble back into ruin, your knowledge has mutated into a weapon of destruction. The goal of the Christian life is not winning a theological debate or proving how free you are. The goal is preserving the flock.
Having established this absolute necessity of voluntary restraint, Paul transitions into the famous athletic metaphor to show what this restraint looks like in daily practice. We move from the theological debate into the stadium.
Verse 24.
Yes, in verse 24, Paul writes, "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that ye may obtain." Activity is not sufficient. Focused, intense effort is required.
Paul is trying to shatter the passive complacency of the Corinthian believers. He demands that they recognize the Christian life is not a state of static spiritual luxury where you just sit around discussing philosophy. It is an intense, active race.
It takes work.
In the Isthmian stadium, many athletes ran, but only one received the prize. Now, Paul does not mean only one Christian makes it to heaven. He uses the competitive reality of their culture to illustrate the absolute focus and energy required.
Then we hit verse 25, which introduces the principle of ekrateia, meaning absolute self-control in all things. Let us go back to that pagan athlete for a second. We need to really feel the physical reality of that 10-month training.
It was brutal.
Picture waking up before dawn, day after day. Your muscles are screaming. You are eating the most bland, restricted diet imaginable. No rich foods, no wine. You are abstaining from physical intimacy. You are denying yourself every single comfort your culture tells you is yours by right.
The sweat, the restriction, the singular focus on the day of the contest. The mental fortitude required to sustain that level of deprivation for almost a year is staggering.
And you are doing this for a salad that will rot by Tuesday. Meanwhile, the Christian life is a highly competitive race against the flesh for an eternal, incorruptible reward. And yet, we often want to run it while lounging on a sofa.
The contrast of the crowns is the theological anchor here. Paul highlights the sheer irrationality of the Corinthian mindset. If pagans are willing to exercise total, agonizing physical restriction for a piece of dying vegetation, the Christians' refusal to mortify their earthly appetites for an incorruptible, eternal crown is completely absurd.
We want the crown without the conditioning.
Spot on. Paul introduces the Greek verb agoutizomai, from which we get our English word agonize. This describes the sweat-soaked struggle of the wrestler. Everyone who enters this intense combat must exercise self-control in all things.
But hold on, does this not sound like we are earning our salvation by trying really hard?
I can see why someone would ask that.
Yeah, how do we reconcile this intense, agonizing running with the core Protestant concept of free grace? If I have to agonize and sweat and restrict myself, it sounds like my effort is purchasing my standing before God.
That is a crucial distinction to make, and we have to look at how our Reformed sources frame this. They argue that the running is the fruit of grace, not the root of it. The grace that saves a person also trains that person to deny ungodliness.
Let us break that down without the heavy theological jargon. What does that mean practically?
It means that you do not run the race to gain entry into the stadium. You are not trying to purchase a ticket with your sweat. According to this framework, you are justified by faith alone. The ticket is completely free, purchased by someone else.
Okay, I follow you.
But the moment you are handed that ticket, an active, ongoing war ignites between your flesh and the spirit. The race does not purchase your justification. The race proves that your justification is real. Grace places you on the track and supplies the oxygen in your lungs to actually run.
Running requires intense focus, but the Christian life also requires violent opposition against a very real enemy. So Paul moves from the running track to the boxing ring to describe this internal war.
Right in verse 26.
He declares that he does not run aimlessly, nor does he shadowbox. He says he does not fight as one beating the air. He strikes a real enemy.
He refuses to engage in superficial theatrical displays of religiosity. Think about a shadow boxer. They might look incredibly impressive. They might have perfect form, throwing lightning-fast combinations in front of a mirror. They look like champions.
But they're not hitting anything.
Exactly. Well, yes, they never actually make contact with an opponent. They expend massive amounts of energy without striking anything that matters.
A lot of modern spiritual leadership looks a lot like shadowboxing. It is performative. It looks busy, it looks exhausting, but it is not actually landing blows against sin or advancing anything meaningful. Which brings us to the climax in verse 27.
This is where the language gets really intense.
Yes, Paul uses incredibly violent Greek terminology here. He uses the word hypopiazo, which literally means to give a black eye or to bruise beneath the eye, and he pairs it with douages, which means to drag into slavery. He uses these terms to describe his treatment of his own physical body and his carnal appetites.
He views his physical body with its fallen carnal passions as a dangerous opponent that must be aggressively subdued. He literally says he drags his body into slavery. In the natural fallen state, the body constantly seeks to assert its rule over the spirit.
The appetites call the shots.
Right. The appetites dictate the actions. Paul reverses this order, forcing his physical appetites to serve the purposes of the gospel.
And the terrifying purpose behind this brutal self-discipline is laid out at the end of the verse. Lest by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. The Greek word there is adokimos.
We need to define adokimos very strictly according to our sources. It means rejected as counterfeit or unfit for use.
Like a fake coin.
Yes. In the ancient world, it described debased metals that were unfit for coinage, or athletes who violated the rules and were stripped of their crowns.
Now, different theological traditions handle this verse very differently. Some look at castaway and say, see, you can lose your eternal salvation if you mess up.
Yeah, but the Reformed sources we are analyzing argue vehemently against that interpretation.
Yeah.
They maintain that adokimos, in this context, does not mean a true believer loses their eternal salvation.
What does it mean, then?
They argue it means losing ministerial approval, losing your usefulness, and losing your reward. It means God places the unrepentant, undisciplined leader on the spiritual rubbish heap. You are shelved. You are no longer fit for the work.
This brings up the massive paradox of the herald, or the kuriks in Greek. In the Isthmian games, the herald was the official who stood in the center of the stadium, announced the rules with a loud voice, and called the runners to the starting line.
But the herald himself did not compete.
Right. Paul fears the ultimate irony of functioning as the herald of the gospel, calling everyone else to the starting line, explaining the rules of holiness while failing to obey those rules himself.
The terrifying peril is that the herald, who has spent his life directing others toward the celestial crown, might himself be excluded from the reward of active service because of a lack of personal holiness.
It is like a brilliant architect who spends his entire career designing a massive, beautiful, impregnable fortress. He builds this structure for others to find refuge in during a bitter, freezing winter storm.
Right, a safe place.
Hundreds of people listen to his advice, run inside the doors he designed, and are saved from the freezing cold. But the architect himself stubbornly refuses to enter the fortress. He sleeps outside the walls and perishes in the snow. He provided the means of salvation for everyone else, but derived no benefit from it himself.
His professional brilliance saved others, but his personal stubbornness resulted in his own ruin. He knew all the technical specifications of the walls, but he refused to take shelter behind them.
But let me pause here, because when Paul talks about bruising his body and making it a slave, we have to be careful. How do we prevent this from spiraling into unhealthy asceticism or physical self-harm?
That's a huge issue in church history.
Yeah, history is full of monks whipping themselves, wearing hair shirts, and sleeping on stone floors to achieve holiness. How is Paul's instruction different from that?
That is a vital clarification. The physical body is created by God and is destined for glorious resurrection. Paul is not advocating for a hatred of the physical form, nor is he promoting self-flagellation.
So no whips.
No whips. The violence of hypopiazo, that black eye, is directed at the indwelling sin and the carnal appetites that try to rule the body.
So he is not punching himself in the face.
No. The goal is to make the body a willing servant to Christ, not a tyrant over the soul. It is about mastery over your impulses, not the destruction of your biological tissue.
All right.
When the alarm goes off early so you can pray, and your body screams for more sleep, subduing the flesh means getting out of bed anyway. When your appetite demands you eat to the point of gluttony, subduing the flesh means pushing the plate away.
Paul's fear of becoming disqualified is not some abstract theological concept. It happens every day. J. Oswald Sanders categorizes the tangible, specific traps that drag leaders into becoming adokimos. Let us look at what the shadowboxing actually looks like in daily life.
Very practical.
Let us examine the internal perils of leadership in practice.
Sanders begins with pride, which he calls the primordial sin. It is the sin that transformed an anointed cherub into the adversary. And Sanders points out that pride is notoriously difficult to spot in yourself.
Because it hides so well.
Exactly. Yes, it masks itself. So he provides 3 specific tests. First, the test of precedence. Second, the test of sincerity. Third, the test of criticism.
Let us talk about that test of precedence for a moment, because this one hurts. I want you, the listener, to picture a scenario. Imagine a peer at your workplace or a fellow volunteer in your community organization receiving the exact recognition you've been working toward for years.
That's a tough spot.
The boss calls them up in front of the whole team, gives them the title, gives them the applause, and hands them the project you wanted.
Now monitor your internal reaction in that exact split second.
Yes. The immediate internal reaction you feel in your chest reveals the true state of your soul. If your stomach drops, if you feel an immediate urge to subtly undermine their success in your next conversation, if you think, well, they only got it because they flattered the boss, you are failing the test of pride.
That immediate internal reaction is the exact terrain where the spiritual boxing match occurs. That flash of resentment is the opponent. If you let that resentment live, if you feed it, you are losing the fight. You are shadowboxing while the enemy lands a hook to your jaw.
Then there's the test of sincerity. Sanders describes this as how you handle it when other people identify the very weaknesses you privately admit to yourself.
We all have moments of false humility where we say, oh, I am such a terrible public speaker, or I'm really struggling with time management lately. We say it fishing for a compliment.
We want reassurance.
Right. We want someone to say, no, you are doing great. But what happens when someone agrees with you? What happens when they say, you know, you are right. Your presentation was disorganized today.
Instantly, the defenses go up. You feel insulted by the exact critique you just offered about yourself.
Spot on. And the third test is the test of criticism. Do you rush to justify yourself the moment you are critiqued? Think about the last time your spouse or your boss criticized your work.
I do this all the time.
Did your brain immediately start drafting a defense attorney's closing argument before they even finish their sentence? That immediate defensiveness, that inability to just listen and consider the feedback, is what Sanders is warning about.
Another peril Sanders identifies is egotism, which is the subtle art of making everything about yourself. He illustrates this with Robert Louis Stevenson's story of the veiled prophet.
That's a fascinating story.
This prophet claimed his glory was too brilliant for mortal men to behold, so he wore a magnificent veil. He built a whole religion around his supposed brilliance. But when the veil finally fell away, it exposed a decrepit, ugly old man trying to hide his own decay.
The spiritual leader stands in constant peril of this internal ugliness. Egotism demands the spotlight. It views the success of the organization solely through the lens of how it reflects on the leader.
Then there is jealousy and envy, which is measuring another person's fruit as a direct threat to your own standing. Moses conquered this beautifully in the Old Testament. Joshua came running to him, demanding that two men, Eldad and Medad, be stopped from prophesying in the camp because they were outside the official tent of meeting.
Joshua was jealous for Moses' sake.
Right. But Moses responded by wishing that all of God's people were prophets. He refused to protect his own monopoly on spiritual influence. Modern ministries and businesses often fail this test miserably by being incredibly territorial.
They view the church down the street or the rival department in the company as competition rather than an ally.
And this feeds directly into the peril of popularity and personality cults. This is measuring success by crowd size and compromising the truth to keep the multitudes happy. Charles Spurgeon, who wrestled with immense historic success in London, warned that popularity easily goes to a man's head. It acts like an intoxicant.
Another historical figure, Robert Murray M'Cheyne, was so terrified of this dynamic that after preaching to massive crowds, he would literally go into private, kneel down, and symbolically place the crown of success back on Christ's brow. He knew that the dopamine hit of a cheering crowd could rewrite his brain's priorities.
Let us talk about that mechanism. How does popularity rewrite a leader's brain? The pragmatism and seeker-sensitive metrics of our modern era create an environment where the leader fears the crowd far more than they fear God.
It happens slowly. You preach a hard truth and attendance dips. You preach an uplifting therapeutic message and giving goes up. Over time, the brain's risk assessment centers unconsciously learn to avoid the hard truths.
It's just human nature.
It is. You start adjusting the message without even realizing it. You file down the sharp edges of the gospel to make it algorithm-friendly. You offer therapeutic half-truths because those keep the audience engaged and giving.
The metrics demand that you keep the numbers up at all costs. And these perils are so insidious because they look like success. A well-deserved promotion quietly morphs into pride. A long tenure at a church or a company becomes a toxic sense of indispensability, where you believe the place will collapse without you. Sudden success leads to unhinged elation.
Faithfulness must be the metric, not the head count. When you start judging your ministry by the metrics of the Corinthian stadium, crowd noise, visibility status, you are already on the path to becoming a dokimos.
But let me ask you this. If popularity is so exceedingly dangerous, should a faithful leader actively try to be unpopular? Should we just be as offensive and abrasive as possible to prove we do not care about the crowd?
Definitely not.
How do you balance a genuine desire to reach many people with the looming danger of accidentally building a personality cult?
Reaching people is a valid biblical goal. The instruction is to preach to all nations, to gather the flock. But the trap is adjusting the nature of the message to secure the audience. Being needlessly offensive or abrasive is not a virtue. The message itself is the offense.
The cross is offensive enough.
Spot on. The unvarnished truth of Scripture is enough to challenge people. If preaching the full truth thins the crowd, the faithful leader accepts that loss. You do not change the rules of the king to keep the stadium full.
If the perils are this severe and the required mortification of our sin is this intense, looking inward is eventually going to lead to absolute despair. We cannot generate this level of sustained holiness on our own.
No, we'd burn out immediately.
If all we have is the demand to run harder, we are going to collapse. We must look to the Christological fulfillment. According to our sources, we must look to the only perfect leader who actually finished the race.
Christ is the true runner and the true fighter. The Reformed framework draws a sharp contrast between the first Adam and the last Adam. Think about the setting for the first Adam. He was placed in a lush garden of absolute abundance.
He had everything.
He had everything he could ever need. He faced a simple test of appetite regarding one specific tree, and he failed. He lacked self-control, indulging his carnal desire, and plunged humanity into ruin.
And contrast that with Jesus, whom Paul calls the last Adam. He conquered appetite in a barren wilderness while starving for 40 days and 40 nights. The devil assaulted him at his absolute weakest physical point, offering him bread.
And Jesus didn't break.
Yet Christ subdued every temptation with the unyielding word of God. Where Adam failed in luxury, Christ triumphed in starvation.
Christ is the only true dokimos. He's the only one who is fully tested, refined in the furnace of suffering, and declared perfectly approved. At his baptism, his transfiguration, and his resurrection, the Father declared absolute approval over him. He relinquished his heavenly rights, his exousia, to take the form of a servant.
And crucially, Christ did not bruise his own body for indwelling sin, because he possessed none. He was entirely sinless. Instead, he allowed his body to be bruised by others to pay for our chronic lack of self-control. As the prophet Isaiah says, he was bruised for our iniquities.
This brings us to the concepts of Christ's active and passive obedience, which are central to the sources we are reviewing. Let us break down those terms so they make sense. Active obedience refers to Christ's perfect law-keeping throughout his life.
So he lived a perfect life.
He ran the race perfectly. Passive obedience refers to his willing suffering and death on the cross, paying the penalty for our failures.
So our standing before a holy God relies entirely on Christ's perfect record being credited or imputed to us. We do not secure our justification by our own athletic running.
Yes, entirely.
Yeah.
The security of the believer rests in the finished work of Christ.
The law now functions as a rule of life for the believer. It points us back to the pattern of Christ. It is like a runner who is lined up on the starting block for a marathon. You are stretching, you are sweating, you are nervous. But before the starting gun even fires, the race official walks over, secures the gold medal around your neck, and says, "The victory is already yours. The prize is secured. Now run."
That completely changes the motivation for the race.
It changes everything. The running becomes an act of overwhelming, joyful gratitude. It is not a desperate, anxious attempt to avoid poverty or earn the official's approval. You run because you are already accepted in him.
The finished work of Christ empowers the agonizing race of sanctification. You fight the flesh not to become loved, but because you already are.
But practically speaking, when a leader actually fails, when they fail the test of pride or they fall into a moral compromise, when the shadowboxing catches up to them, what is the immediate practical step given this theological reality?
It's a sobering question.
If the gold medal is already won, what happens when they trip and fall flat on their face on the track?
True grace allows for honest, crushing confession. Because the justification is secure, the fallen leader does not have to hide their sin. They must repent entirely. Practically, this means stepping down from public ministry to receive discipline humbly. They must make restitution where possible.
They cannot just offer a vague apology video and go back to work the next week.
No. The preservation of the flock demands that the disqualified herald be removed from the center of the stadium. But most importantly, they must look to the cross, where their justification remains eternally secure, even if their public platform is gone forever. The grace of God does not make sin light, it makes Christ precious.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let us summarize the core insights we have uncovered from Corinth and from Sanders. The Christian life requires a brutal, active, daily warfare against indwelling sin. It is not a luxury cruise.
No, it is battle.
The higher your sphere of influence, the greater the danger to your soul.
Yeah.
We have to reject the cultural illusion of safe privilege, ruthlessly discipline our appetites, and rest the entirety of our hope on the perfect obedience of Jesus Christ.
We cannot rely on past successes, correct theological knowledge, or current popularity to shield us from the necessity of daily self-mortification. The herald is subject to the rules of the race.
I want to leave you with a final, unexamined idea to ponder as you go about your day. Think about the Apostle Paul. Here is a man who literally saw the risen Christ on the Damascus Road, a man who possessed apostolic authority, who planted churches across the known world, and who wrote half of the New Testament.
A giant of the faith.
If a man with that much privilege lived his life with a holy, trembling fear of becoming spiritually useless, what entirely legal, permissible comfort in your life right now is quietly lulling you to sleep? Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking. Keep running the race.